YouTube channel for you to watch later and share with others. Everyone is on mute by default. If you have a question while Wendy is going through the presentation, there's a chat line just on, I think it's the right of the screen where you can see the chat function come up. You can just type the question in there and we'll have people monitoring those questions, and we'll have time hopefully for some questions for Wendy from that chat. If you can't, having troubles with the chat, please email your question to Keenan. So in the email link that Shahab sent out earlier, Keenan's email address is there. Now, during the presentation, Wendy might ask some questions, such as, who's familiar with this or that. So if asked, you can raise your hand by using the hand button on Microsoft Teams. So it's just in the middle bar there with all the commands on it. And then just remember to lower it afterwards. If you do have any technical questions, please just use the chat or the email on the side. So we will have people monitoring the chat and the email throughout the presentation. So just a short introduction to PIANC. So for those of you that don't know, PIANC is the global organisation for water transport infrastructure. It was established in 1885, so it's one of the oldest technical associations in existence, and it provides guidance and technical advice in relation to infrastructure, supports and marinas and waterways. PIANC is represented by chapters all around the world and holds major events to keep international waterborne transport community connected. So that's us. Now I will introduce Wendy without further ado. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce her. She's a colleague and a friend. She'll be presenting today on Vessel Traffic Services, or VTS for short. And it's basically the system and the people responsible for facilitating safe transit of vessels into Sydney Harbour. Wendy's going to talk through the progression of technology over the years and give us an insight into why this system is so important, and particularly given the ever-increasing size of vessels coming into our port. So just a bit about Captain Wendy. She's a Masterclass 1 mariner. She has experience on a vast range of vessels, tankers, bulk carriers, scientific vessels, icebreakers. She joined Port Authority in 2016. And one of Wendy's biggest achievements over the time has been overseeing the certification of Sydney's VTS and also establishing a lot of risk-based management processes and procedures for vessel monitoring in the ports of Sydney and Botany. Currently, Wendy is the manager of maritime projects for Port Authority. She leads several operational projects across the state. Now, sadly, Port Authority will shortly be losing Wendy. She's just agreed to take up the role as Harbour Master for Tasmania and for Tasports. And as sad as we are to lose Wendy, this role is absolutely well-deserved. It's a well-deserved achievement for Wendy in her career, and it's a testament to her intelligence and her skill as a mariner and a leader. So Wendy, when you're ready, we'll get you to kick off, please, in your presentation. And thank you in advance for talking to us today and taking us through this topic.
Wendy, I think you're on mute.
Oh, guys, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
So that was actually what I was saying. I was actually saying, I hope you can hear me. I've got a little button here that sometimes catches me out. So firstly, I want to just actually warn everybody, this is the first time I've done it in this type of platform before. I have done this presentation before, but it's been to an audience and on a stage. And I normally walk around the stage a lot, but I'm going to sit here and try and stay focused here. So at any stage, if you start to leave me falling off camera or something, let me know, because I'm just trying to work off the laptop. So I'm about to talk about technology, but we had a pretty bad dress rehearsal yesterday. So thank you, Kath. Thanks for that lovely introduction. My name is Wendy Doran, and I work for the Port Authority New South Wales as Manager Maritime Projects. And I'm going to present to you today about VTS and how it is an all-encompassing aid to navigation. Now, what I do when I start this presentation is I generally open up with these photos. And what this is all this is doing is telling you that my background is shipping. That up in the top corner, you can see my first ship that was taken in 1992. It's a crude oil carrier. And that's photos of me training to become an officer on board a ship. I went on to do second mates, masters. Now, the reason why I use these photos is because it's something that is, you kind of make the assumption that people migrate very easily from sea to port, and that the qualifications or even the standards are set across the board, and they're not. And so effectively, there is an international body that sets standards and regulations for vessels. And I always love to just say that a definition of a vessel is really something that just floats. And I think you would all know what that body is. Can everybody know the international body that looks after maritime vessels? I can't actually see the hand, so I'm just going to kick on. It's the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, governs everything that floats. Now, I'm just going to really quickly talk about this one, and then we're going to come back to it a bit later, because what the IMO does is they do conventions and they do resolutions. And the conventions, you know, a lot of them are part of our everyday world in seafaring. And a few of them, ones that are very popular that you would know, are SOLAS and MARPOL. And what happens is that signatory nations are part of the IMO. They are flag states of the IMO. And then they need to ratify their the conventions that IMO partake in, and they generally need a representative body to do that. And in Australia, as you know, it's AMSA. Now, AMSA needs to ratify that, and they do that by way of NAVAC 2012. Don't hold your breath for the next Navigation Act, because it took 100 years to go from 1912 to 2012. So we're not expecting the next one fast. And then they're promulgated by way of marine orders. Now, what we do in Australia quite well is exactly that column that I've just showed you. Australia, very simplistically, and AMSA does a fantastic job of it, of taking out pieces of the conventions that apply to you on a vessel. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it applies on a port. Now, we're going to come back to this, but what I want to do is start talking about ports. And I want to introduce you to a vessel called the Dunbar. Does anybody know the story of the Dunbar? And I don't, Kath, can we see any hands going up or nodding or shaking? Essentially, if you are, I was about to say calling in, if you're, signing in from around the country, everybody has got a Dunbar. Every state has got a Dunbar, because the Dunbar tells a story, and quite a tragic one, of a vessel that was at sea for months, and it went through storm, and it went through disease, almost plague, probably not coronavirus, but on its way to Australia. And the Dunbar was on its way to a fledgling colony of Sydney town, and it's the early 1800s. And what the Dunbar does is that it's lining up to come into Sydney. Fantastic. Sydney's a deep water port. There's lots of space. And so what it does is, with full wind in its sail on a westerly course, it's lining up, and it's got North Head on its starboard side and South Head on its port side. And that vessel is lining up to come between the two heads of what is now Sydney Harbour. And with full wind in her sail and at her full speed, the Dunbar goes aground at a place we now know as the Gap. And it's a very easy mistake to make, because if you are out just east of the port at the right time of the day, the Gap, or what we now know as the Gap, very much looks like the gap between the two heads. And so there is, automatically that problem was occurring all around the world. If you're calling from South Australia, the amount of vessels that ran aground off of Kangaroo Island, it was continuous. And so then the ports needed to work towards guiding those vessels in. They had spent months at sea only to go aground just minutes away from their port. And so what you're looking at there now is the first AtoN, Aid to Navigation, that was set up in Sydney and almost Australia. And it's Hornby Light. And what we love about Hornby Light is Hornby Light's still there. In fact, Kath, who just introduced me, and Matt Batman have done a fantastic job of getting her all cleaned up, and she just looks beautiful. She doesn't have those sailing ships going past in the background there, but she's there today in exactly the same configuration. And what Hornby Light was doing is, you can see her there in her safe watermarks. If it was colour, you'd see it was red and white. And Hornby Light is saying, to the north, safe water lies to the north of me. And so she's situated on South Head. So what was happening was then these vessels could come from sea and come into the harbour. So we're getting them into the harbour. So we're kind of cooking with gas now, because once we're getting them into the harbour, well, then the port started to think, well, you know what, maybe we should start communicating with the vessels. And so for those that do have marine or any form of tickets at all, you know a thing called the Code of Signals. And the Code of Signals is like those messages that are being promulgated by way of flags. This picture, don't look too deeply into it, because it's got a bit of an artistic interpretation, because that's up the Parramatta River. And what that's indicating is that, you know, a vessel would come in, that the observatory would hoist a flag. That might mean vessels coming in, they're clear of disease, they've been offered pratique, and it will be arriving into dock. And then the next headland would send up the flags, and the next one, and the next one. And the message would be, you know, transmitting up to all the way Parramatta. So we're communicating with the vessels, and then we're doing one other thing. The other thing you can see in that picture is the wind and tide. So what mariners want to know is, mariners want to know about the tide, and they want to know about wind. And so then we're starting, as a port, they're starting to communicate this level of information to them. I had to include this slide because it's something that's quite, I think it's quite special to Sydney Harbour. That's a Harrison tide gate. And as I mentioned, mariners want to know about the tide. And so I would ordinarily ask the question, what else was Harrison famous for? And I think you'd probably all put up your hand or be nodding away, and you'd be saying the clock. And that's correct. Harrison created the first clock, or the first chronometer, that James Cook took to sea, and was then able, with that, used to find longitude. So they've kind of got all bases covered now. And then this is a big kicker. And ordinarily I'd say to you, what do you think's going on in this picture? And I'm hoping you're probably all putting your hands up, and you're probably saying electricity. Because what's happened now is we've got electricity. And here's a picture of South Head Signal Station. And look at that. They're not trying to hide those power cords. Look at the ceramic resistors wrapping up the side, because now they have reached the point where they're able to use a thing called Morse Code. And once they were using Morse Code, they were able to put the written word into a communication. And so it would go something like this, you know, the ship would be going, you know, da da di 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 da 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 di di. And that, of course, is saying, you know, I'm off port. We are clear of, we wish free pratique. And they would respond with da da di 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 di. Yes, continue on into quarantine station. Your pilot will board at 7 o'clock in the morning. So this is where technology is now starting to really take off, and none so much more than the next step, because we were transmitting the written word and we were providing information about tide and wind and weather, but now we're able to speak the word. And this is in the form of a VHF radio. And it's still in the same, like basically the way, in the formation of the waves, still as it is today. And as you can see, back then, you could get a job as a radio officer on a ship and get paid well, and you could go and see the world. Not so much anymore. There's another big step in the technological journey, and this occurs just before the end of the Second World War. And that is that a young guy called Marconi is playing around with radio waves. And what he is able to invent is the radar. Now, this is a monumental step, because everything that I've just talked about thus far has been about communication. It's been about either communicating information, or taking information. But now we've got another really important step here. As far as the ship is concerned, that radar is providing them another way of navigation. But for the port, what it means now is that the port can start tracking the vessels. So if they're communicating, they're able to start organising them, and they're able to start tracking them. And then what happens is it all comes together into what was known back then as Sydney Harbour Control. And that's pretty common across all the ports. It was either called Port Control or Harbour Control or something along those lines. And what they were doing was bringing all the mediums in together. They were bringing in radio, they were starting to track, they were talking, they were communicating, and they were giving information about wind, about tide, all those things that a mariner needs. There's something wrong with that picture. And I think a lot of the people from Sydney would be putting their hands up and saying, no, I know what's wrong with that picture. That tower's not there anymore. So for those that have visited Sydney, you would know that Barangaroo has been developed there and Sydney Harbour Control has gone. There's one other thing that's wrong with that picture, and that is the word control. Because what I would argue and what I would debate is that there was never any control. The only thing we have control of is perhaps like something like a remote control. We can advise, we can recommend, we can instruct, but unless we're the ones that are actually doing the function, we're really not in control. And you'll find that exactly the same process has transpired in the airline industry because they don't refer to it as air traffic control anymore. It's air traffic services. So it's a mechanism by way we bring all the information in together. We try and drive the technologies into one central source. And then what we do is we provide information, we provide advice, and we recommend. We will warn, but we never really have control. What you've got there is a picture of the now Sydney VTS, which is down in the building that's just over here on this other side, and that's the centre. And what you're seeing here is right at the front of the picture, there's one operator that's looking after botany. In the middle, we've got a duty VTS manager that's basically, in the manager of that shift, and in the foreground is the Sydney desk. It's a little bit staged, that shot. I kind of did it because what I'm trying to show there is that there's a lot going on. And in fact, what's happening is 2 ports are being looked after, as well as the scheduling function of the port. And for Sydney, they're remote. Sydney is not looking out of a window anymore at Sydney. Sydney's doing it all by the technological mechanisms that, that have all come in. So let's go back to what we were talking about before. And because I need to show you now how vessel traffic services then came to play. Because as I mentioned, the IMO looks after seaborne vessels. It looks after anything that'll float. It really doesn't look after ports. And in fact, for any of us in ports in Australia, all our governance is taken from the state. It's not federal at all. It's from the state. So how is it that we can certify VTS? Because we would need a regulatory body, a competent authority, and you need to meet a certain level of standards. I often use the analogy of a hospital. If I put a bed in my lounge room, which is just here, if I put a bed in my lounge room and I get a nurse and a doctor, am I a hospital? No, I'm not. You don't deem yourself to be a hospital unless you've run through all of the criteria and the levels of quality assurance and competency that needs to be met for that function. And it's the same with VTS. So what we've got here is, let's go back down this page. We did it all before. And what we've got is the IMO coming down to the conventions, signatory nations, the NAV Act of 2012 and marine orders. But now let's go over to the other side of the page, because what IMO did in their absolute wisdom was back in 1998, IMO created a resolution and it was A85720. And in that resolution, they say, you know what? A port could benefit by having a vessel traffic service, and safety could be enhanced. And so all it takes is for that resolution to be mentioned in a SOLAS convention, which is safety of life at sea. And in fact, it is. It's mentioned in SOLAS Chapter 5. And then it flows down that path. So then our competent authority is AMSA. We're in Australia. We need to now apply to the NAV Act of 2012, and there is a Marine Order Part 64 that governs VTS. But this is where it's a bit tricky, because that means you have to create a VTS area, because the port area, as we've just discussed, is under the state legislation. So this is an instrument of authority for Sydney VTS that we applied for. And to do that, what we're doing is we're stating that within this VTS area, the Navigation Act of 2012 and Marine Orders Part 64 will apply. And that's the VTS area there for Sydney. There's something a little bit quirky about that, or not quirky, but something I want to highlight. Look in close at this picture. And what I've given you here is the chartlet, the overlay of the chartlet. And what you're seeing here is there's circles, there's arcs. And what that is the port limits. And we can see that there. And in fact, I mentioned Hornby Light before. Hornby Light's right there. And the arc of radius, 4 nautical miles extending from Hornby Light, actually dictates port limits. But VTS area, we have extended that beyond. And why? And that is because of risk. So what this is all about, and what IALA want the ports to do, is to identify their risks. And when you identify your risk, you might choose that your area needs to extend beyond that of what is in your state legislation. And in fact, one of the reasons why I took it further out is because of these little guys here, and that's the pilot boarding ground. Because what happens is, I knew from my seagoing background, is that the ships will pound in to those pilot boarding grounds to tender a thing called a notice of readiness. And what they're trying to do is, if you've got a public user berth, they're trying to get onto the public user berth before the ship that might be coming in behind them. So hence, it's quite advantageous to have your pilot boarding ground within your VTS area, because you can start, I'm not going to use the word control, but you can start to recommend, advise and warn ships and say, advice, remain east of the pilot boarding ground, because you may have one coming in, one going, or one going out. It's about trying to organise the scheduling. I'm just going to steal a picture from another port, and I hope they don't mind. And anyone who's called in from Western Australia, and if you're from Port Hedland, I do apologise if I get anything wrong. Because one of the reasons why I want to flag Port Hedland is they've done an amazing job, because what they've done is they really recognise their risk. And I want you to just have a look at this picture, because if you see down the bottom in the legend, it says the territorial sea boundary. And I would ordinarily ask the question, what's the territorial sea? It's probably a bit hard in this forum. The territorial sea is 12 nautical miles. So this line here marks 12 nautical miles. So what Port Hedland has done is they have extended their VTS area well past their port limits, up past the territorial sea and out to 23 nautical miles. And why? Because their vessels are so big. They are so big that they need to basically line them up and monitor them as they come in and enter their channel. And the movement in the channel is down to the decimeter. So what they've done is they've gone through a risk assessment process, and they've elected to make their VTS area a lot bigger. What I was going to do, but I can't see my notes, is I was actually going to quote one little section from IALA, and that is about identifying risk. And what they'll say is that it takes two factors. That it takes two factors to combine to create an incident or an accident. And it's about recognising and addressing these, or looking at them, and to establish, what is the lowest possible, risk that you want to take. So I'll just move on to that. So that's really interesting. So IALA are already saying you need two risk factors, and those combined will create, what possibly is an incident or an accident. And so I'm going to tell you that those risks are mechanical, they're environmental, or they're human. And the mechanical is a fantastic one to look at for the port, because not so much on the port side, but definitely on the ship. Because what the ship is doing, the ship is coming in and they want to protect themselves from the port. They don't want to hit the port. And the port are trying to protect themselves from the ship. So each one of them puts contingency plans or risk management in place. And it might come in the form of, say, for the vessel is coming in and it's doubling up everything for redundancy. It's putting extra steering gears on. It's putting extra generators on. So that if there is an equipment failure, it's going to fall back onto the redundancy and that main propulsion will stay in place. And on the port side, what the port is doing was they're looking at their passage plan. And what they should be doing is saying, okay, where are the tugs are an essential item once those vessels slow down. So where are those tug meeting points? And this is a really good, so I want to just take the time and just show to you about this little story I've got here. And it happened long before I came to the Port Authority. It happened back in 2012. And this vessel is called the Shan-He. And it's a great story. Well, it's not a great story because the poor pilot that was on board, he had a bit of PTSD from it. But it's a great story in the fact that for us to be able to analyse it, we've been able to learn so much. And so, like all good incidents and accidents, do they happen at 10 o'clock in the morning on a nice sunny day? No, they don't. In fact, so just before midnight, the Shan-He is coming into Botany, and at the same time, there's a vessel called the Sutra Boom, and she's coming out. Now, up in the top corner, we can see the time. It's 23:54, and the vessels are doing 10.9 knots apiece, and they are passing. Now, I want you to look at where they're passing. Let's go back to the other slide. Let's go back to that one. They're passing around here. So where they're passing in a pretty confined place going in. And so what happens as the vessels pass, approximately 2 minutes after the Shan-He passes the Sutra Boom, a spring in the solenoid of the hunting gear of the steering motor, it breaks. And the end result is that the rudder shears to starboard. And the vessel that is doing now, as it's leaving the channel, 7.8 knots, so around 8 knots, is it has no steering. So she's left the channel. Now, if we go back a step, what we would have noticed was that the vessel has gone to starboard. Had that incident have occurred 2 minutes earlier and the vessel gone to port, it would have been a whole different incident altogether. Now, what's happening is she's leaving the channel. Now, I want to highlight something to you because as she's leaving the channel, there's only one thing now that's going to stop that vessel at 8 knots going aground. And I would ask, actually, does anybody know what would stop this vessel from going aground? I don't know if we're going to get any head. I'll just tell you, it's the anchor. So what needs to happen is that this vessel needs to drop an anchor. And bearing in mind that this vessel is 270 metres long, and so she's coming out, but he's got a problem with dropping the anchor, and that is, if we can just look at this chart of the passage plan, you can see all of these little fuel lines coming over, and they're running over from La Perouse and Bear Island, and they're going over to Kurnell carrying fuel. So it's not water, it's carrying fuel. So the pilot knows now he's got a problem because he needs to drop the anchor, but he thinks there's a fuel line around near him somewhere, and he's not quite sure when to drop it. Now, I'd ask you the question now is, can you see that fuel line there? And I think you're going to say no, because at this particular time, this is what the VTS are looking at. And the VTS haven't actually got the layers on their charts at the moment to see the fuel lines. So if he was in a situation where if he was calling the VTS and said, can I drop the anchor, they would not going to be able to advise. Now, here's the next thing. Where's the tugs? So they've just come through the most narrowest part of the port. He's lost control. He's heading out, and where are the tugs? Tugs aren't there. And in fact, actually what's happening is the PB Murray's over here in the corner, and it is trying to thunder down. He can see that this ship is in trouble because they don't head this. That's where the proposed new cruise terminal was to be, over there. There's no cruise terminal over there. He's just heading straight to land. So here's the next thing. So the meeting point of the tugs, it wasn't there. So what happens is he wants to drop the anchor. He wants 3 shackles out, which would be, let's say, about 90 metres. And instead what happens is he's doing a pretty big speed. And instead of 90 metres, ends up with 270 metres out, 9 shackles in the water. And the vessel is 270 metres again. So what happens is the vessel finally swings clear 40 metres from the shallows. It was 40 metres from going aground. So that's just an indicator of mechanical error in a point, coming into a port. So the ship is doubling up everything to try and save that mechanical error. And what the port needs to do is identify if that risk is going to take place. Where are the vessels passing? That's the scheduling. Is everybody on the same page? Are we all looking at the same chart? Where are the meeting points from our tugs? What are the speeds of the port? And this was an incremental step for me, because now I was suddenly not thinking so much about being the person on the ship, but then I was looking about how risk portrays into the port and how VTS was going to be instrumental in reducing this. The next risk or hazard that I mentioned was environmental. And so environmental is an interesting one because it's pretty much out of our control. And in fact, for a ship coming into port, they really, once they're alongside and the engine's switched off and they've got the mooring lines out, they're really quite vulnerable. And that one was an interesting one for to sort of, take the VTS on that journey. What you've got is a picture here of a ship, the ship called the OOCL Hong Kong. And what's happened here is we don't swing the ships in the middle of the Brotherson Dock. What's happened is she's supposed to be over on that side with the yellow cranes, and she was starboard side 2, and she broke one mooring line. The winds came up, one mooring line broke, the pressure on the other mooring lines broke, so then the next mooring line, and so what's come down is she's down to one mooring knot line, similar to the Seabourn Encore we saw a few years over in New Zealand. And so what's happened is an emergency is declared. We've got everything out there. You can see the tugs going out, the Port Authority sending another tug out, the cutters racing over to take a pilot. And what happens is that vessel actually goes on to hit that Maersk ship on the other side. So there is, okay, what are we going to do about weather? Well, with weather, what we need to do is we need to set protocols. So there's certain levels at which, storm moorings have to be introduced, or we'll ask them to run extra moorings. And in fact, what we did was when we were certifying the VTS, we recognized that, it was better if we looked ahead at the weather. What we could say was, well, if that ship's coming in and we know that it's going to have strong wind while it's in, we'll let them know. So the masters of the vessels are getting advised really early on that strong wind's going to be they're going to experience while they're in port, and they're asked to run extra lines on arrival. And what they're advised, at some point we're going to have to kick in the storm moorings. And storm moorings are a pretty big thing over down there on the container berths, because once they're out, particularly on the side, the DP or side of the yellow cranes, they can't run the portainer crane up and down. So it has an economic effect. Now the last one is human error. I always make this joke, and I can't help myself, and I'm really sorry, but I always like to say in Sydney, the problem is that people don't realise they're human, because as you can see, that is a really large tanker and it's coming out of Sydney, and all it takes for that poor little yacht is for a mast to break or a rudder to fail, and the situation will be quite different. So human error is either something about protecting people from themselves, or when we might make a mistake. And we will make thousands of decisions in any given day. And many times when we're making those decisions, sometimes we're going to be wrong. And that's kind of what happened in the picture that you're looking at here. So that's actually Circular Quay. And what we've got there is a freshwater class ferry that is connecting with Jetty 3. It should actually be coming in to go alongside. And it's more or less, the ferry's T-boned the vessel. So what happened here was the passenger ship that's berthing up there at the OPT, they use thrusters to berth. And the bigger that the passenger ships have gotten, or the more sophisticated that their propulsion systems have gotten, the larger the energy is created from the propulsion. And you can see the plumes actually extending out from the passenger ship. So what happens is, so that everybody can live in harmony, what we've done is recognise this risk and put in like a curfew. So give the passenger ships a crack. They've got a crack until from from 5 till 6:30, from 4:30 till 6 in the morning to come alongside. And then after that, we undertake that we won't use propulsion on the passenger ships unless it's an absolute emergency. And therefore, then that's giving the ferries a chance to come in and out and in and out. And those passengers on that ferry, which are commuters in Sydney, they have just as much right to go to work in a safe manner as what we do to try and keep that passenger ship safe. Now, you'll notice that Circular Quay looks very quiet. And no, it's not in the middle of COVID. What's actually happening there is, would you believe it was the 29th of December? It is at 5 minutes to 6 in the morning, and that's why there's little movement. So in that instance, what happened was when the passenger ships started to come alongside, VTS made out an all ships, Sydney VTS, information, traffic information. A passenger vessel is manoeuvring alongside Circular Quay with propulsion systems, all vessels to remain clear or navigate with caution. The message would be something along those lines. And that's giving those, the ferries a chance to say, oh, okay, all right, look, I'll just hang out, This was at 4 minutes, it was before 6 o'clock in the morning. And so the propulsion systems being used by the passenger ships were within the curfew parameters. And it was actually part of the training that the freshwater ferries don't come in. But on this particular day, the captain thought, oh, look, you know what, I'll give it a crack. And it didn't work so well. What I did with in this instance was I actually saved the footage and gave it to Harbour City Ferries so they could use it as training, because you know, obviously it's a pretty dynamic area, Circular Quay. The reason why I've got this slide up is to show you this is actually the old screen. So this isn't the modern, this isn't the one that we've got now down in the, it's called a decision support tool, a DST. And this is where the interface of radar comes in and ships AIS. And what happens is a very long algorithm, equation is done, which is taking all the feed from the radar and the AIS to acquire a target. So what the operator's done here is they've acquired the ship that's coming in, which is the MS Asia. She's a really large tanker, and you can see that by the size of her. And alongside her are the two Svitzer tugs. We've got the Wallara and the Warrawee. And so what happens is we've got radars scattered around the port, and they will echo, those echoes bouncing off of the ship. And what it does, it's the way that the calculation works, and I'm probably not the best person to be sort of pulling apart that equation, but it's along the lines of the loudest echo. There's a bit of an issue with ships AIS, and I'll talk to you about that a bit later. But what this is really good is you can see, like, there's the Ocean Dreaming. She's a fast ferry. She's got a massive vector and a big plume coming out behind. So what's happening is all the information is coming in on this decision support tool, and also what can happen is in many ports the CCTV is also linked in. Now, when IALA were looking at VTS, they initiated, types of service. Now, I'm not going to dwell on that too much in this, and because also what's going to happen is they're going to be removed, because what IALA have actually recognised is we may have probably overcooked it a bit. We may have actually really confused it, and people got really hung up on this bottom one, which is navigational assistance service, and to the point that people sort of thinking, well, is this the introduction to remote pilotage? And it's not. Because what I've done here is I've actually got the two definitions here of information service and navigation assistance service. And what I've done is I've highlighted and to monitor its effects. So effectively in that screen that we're just looking at, we're monitoring. So to be an information service, you're giving the information. To be a TOS, you're organising your traffic and scheduling. And then to be a NAS, you're engaged in the monitoring. So you want to see what the effects are. You're monitoring the effect. If I say to that vessel, information, you are deviated from the standardized passage plan, and that vessel does nothing, then I'm monitoring the effect to know that vessel's done nothing. So then we need to bring it back. I'll just go back quickly to that screen too, because when we're talking human factor, we've also got the factor that vessel's coming in and about to undertake a very big course alteration. And it may be that every now and then what we see is across the world is incidents where a human factor is played in, where despite the fact that that particular voyage may have been done many, many hundreds of times, it may be that for some reason that course alteration was missed, or they lined up the wrong beacon, or the weather was to play as well, and so then we're seeing that human factor lie in. Okay, so I mentioned that we're monitoring. How are we monitoring? And one of the very first ones that we had was equipment and the VHF radio. For us in VTS, I have to tell you, that's the deal breaker. If you have not got VHF radio, then that's we're actually not monitoring. And the state legislation always comes back to the state legislation will always come back to that VHF availability as well. So that's a picture of a, what do we got there? We've got a bulk carrier lining up for the Harbour Bridge and coming in and around to Glebe or White Bay. I mentioned to you the radars, and we've got them positioned around the harbour and down at South Head in Botany. And what you can see here is there's a picture of a radar, and what we've done there is we've actually turned the acquisition function off. We've turned the monitoring function off. So that's what that would look like, just the little echoes. But when we switch the monitoring function on to help assist us to create decisions, that's when we get the vectors and we can see where its course is laying or bearing, and we can also detect its speed. I mentioned AIS, and I just want you to have a look up here in the top corner. You can see these yellow shapes that are alongside. And I mentioned there's a bit of a problem with AIS, and there is, because if you see that vessel, it looks like it's sitting on Brotherson Dock number 6. And I can definitely tell you that ship was not sitting on Brotherson Dock. But it's a lot to do with the way that nav aid, so a nav aid is internal of the vessel. Your radars, your AIS, your PPUs, they're all nav aids. AtoNs are external of the vessel, lighthouses, beacons, VTS. So so what's happened with the AIS is it's not heavily, the position of the antenna is not heavily regulated, and it actually gives you a bit of a message, and it says that, my antenna is positioned, X amount of meters off the center line of the vessel, and sometimes it's wrong. The other picture that we've got down here is Sydney Harbour on Australia Day. So that's, you can see there's a lot happening. You see all the names, the vectors, the arrows. It's just a little melting pot. So I'll just try and speed up a little bit because I'm pretty conscious of the time. So the other thing was I mentioned CCTV, and that is what we've been able to obtain, literally in the last possibly decade. So I came to Port Authority at the end of 2016 with to certify the VTS, and one of the things was that they told me was the CCTV was originally hooked up with the original monitoring system, but we basically separated it, and we've got a really great technical team that works for Sydney, and they do a fantastic job. And what happened was the CCTV has basically gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So it meant that we can put more cameras, and we're running it through its own server. So you can see that that's down the bottom. You'll see we zoomed in on a large container ship as she was leaving port. It was her maiden voyage in, and she's quite a long way out and about to line up to go out through the Botany Heads. So actually we've flagged that one. Now the other thing was, as you mentioned, as I said before, we're also giving information. So it's not just about tracking them or talking to them, we're also giving them information. And that's about the, we mentioned the wind. So wave, wind and tide are all being fed now into the Port Authority. It's a central source that is actually on the external website. It's actually quite frequently used by a lot of people. And the VTS is constantly constantly monitoring it. It's one of the first things that they'll come in and they open that up, because there you might have a pilot that is climbing on a vessel, has gotten up to the bridge, and they want an update straight away on what the swell's doing or what the wind is looking at. And it may be that, you know, that in the journey or the time traveled from the pilot getting to the ship and up to the bridge, the VTS will say information, we've now got winds in excess of 25 knots, which is a big deal when we're talking about these really big container ships. Now, what we're doing in VTS is we're using technology to extend the bridge team. So the bridge team was a big thing when I did my second mate's ticket. It was about everybody on that bridge being part of a shared mental model to bring that vessel into port. Now, a lot of people would argue that shared mental model, but what happened in this instance was when I was down at the Maritime College, I was introduced to a concept by Ben Brooks, which is port resource management. And it was a real defining moment for me, because I thought, this is what we need to do. If we create the port team and harness all this technology into VTS, we can enhance what's going on board the ship. My colleague, the pilot manager, Matt Stannard, said he referred to it as extending the bridge team. And this picture is showing you is a bit of an indicator on how we're doing it. So what we've got here is a crude oil tanker coming into Gore Cove, a very confined area right in the middle of Sydney. She's come under the Harbour Bridge, and the pilot's there on the bridge wing. Now, it might be that the tug looks out and can't see the lines people or the linesman. And so the tug might call up and say, you know, Captain, look, you know, just for your information, the line service aren't there. And what we've got here is VTS sitting in the centre that's actually kilometres away in Botany, and they're listening in. And they straight away can turn around and say, just come across the top and say, yes, whatever the ship's name is, Emerald Queen, we've just received that information. Advice, we're contacting the lines people now. We will revert back with information. So the pilot in this instance can just keep doing what they're trying to do, not have to worry about getting on the phone or calling, and that was one of the big things I noticed when I was an exempt master was, you know, I may as well have been mopping the floors as well, because it all came to, you're organising the tugs, you're on the phone, and it all fell back to you. And so not only are you trying to ship handle, you've got thrusters going and tugs pushing and lines going ashore and engine and rudder. You also then got to worry about the what's going on ashore. So we're trying to take that element away and trying to create the support for the pilots. This is another piece of technology that I wanted to just quickly throw to you, and that is it's becoming more and more apparent across the ports. And this is the use of a underkill clearance system, or a dynamic underkill clearance system, or a NCOS, which is I always forget the acronym, but it's about enhancing the use of the channel. Apologies if anyone from DHI is calling in. And so what this is doing is all the data from all the buoys is being fed, the vessels have been modelled, and it's all coming into VTS. And VTS are inputting the draft of the vessel, the LOA, the length between perpendiculars, the GM, so that distance between the centre of gravity and the meta-centre. And what that's doing is that's opening up the windows for that vessel to come in through a seaway, because some of these vessels are getting so big that their drafts are so great that the only way that we can get them in is to be constantly monitoring the movement of the seaway with the movement of the vessel. Hope I've explained that. Now, as Kath mentioned, I ran through risk-based procedures, and what I did was this was about taking a team on a journey. So as much as it is technology, I'd actually turn and say it's also culture, because what I needed to do was, when I built all these procedures and took in all those pieces of information that I've just presented to you, I needed a team to use the procedures. And when I was going through my career, the procedures were always really quite stuffy and formal. And what I wanted them to realise was that this should be part of your everyday work, that at any time you can revert to your procedures to find out what your emergency preparedness is. And so hence that's actually the front cover of their risk-based procedures manual. Part of it was, I'll just check the time, is part of it was also a big one for us was a clearance to enter. And I'll just be a bit fast with this one. This was a big deal. And I took this away from, there was a grounding of a vessel called the Morse Code over in Fremantle. And I read that report. And along with the Shanhe, what I was able to do was I thought, okay, if we're really taking risk quite seriously, we're not going to let a vessel into port that doesn't have the correct assigned tugs into it. And so for the first stage, what was actually happening was we started to decline the vessels. And so, and then once we had built this up with the entry procedures, it was really quite a logical step then when Underkill clearance was also brought into the picture, because then it was not only about that you had a berth, a clear channel, tugs, it was then also about that you had enough, the vessel had enough water at the shoal or the bombora to come in. So what we did was we established an abort point or a safety arc. What you're looking at there now is a screenshot from the PPU of a pilot's PPU. That's the standardised passage plan to come into Sydney. And you'll note that what we've got is the abort point. Historically, our pilotage was very much about it was a skill set that you learn, and you know that they would of course train people, but they were kind of reluctant to move towards standardized passage plan. But one of the really important key things about this was that now that we had the technology to take their passage plan and allow another group, or being the VTS, to see the passage plan that the pilots were going to take, we were then able to encourage that interaction. And then they were actually going to be able to provide information that was going to support them. So here is the abort point. And what we say to them, or I say to the team, is this is the point where all the ducks have to be in the road, in a row. That vessel's not to come past, past that point unless it's got all of those requirements that we need for it to come into port. And that's what the VTS is looking at. And that's the safety arc there. Now, I won't play this one because we had dramas with the audio yesterday, but so that was a particular vessel that had got declined entry, and then just after it came in, everything went wrong. The engine would not slow down. It was on full ahead. Luckily he had the two tugs. The wind was coming up. His radio broke, and so if those two tugs hadn't, oh, sorry. Okay. So then what that did was then what happened with the result of that incident was we then discovered that when I started to talk to the staff, it was about the understanding that each ship had different manoeuvring characteristics, that a single screw tanker was going to behave very differently to a passenger ship with azipods, and a container ship again was going to behave differently from a bulk carrier. And this is the sort of thing that we would be taught at sea, and we would know quite well. But we had staff that probably didn't really know the characteristics of the turning circle of these vessels very well. So what we did was then after the certification, we embarked on a refresher training, and it was to bring everyone on the page. And it was fantastic. And I have to say that one of my big ethoses is that whilst we're talking about technology, you will never you can bring all the technology in the world in, and unless you've got the right culture that supports this technology, the right process, then the technology will never meet its the ultimate. I'm just coming down to the last one. I think we're just hitting the time frame. So this is how we now train our staff. They come in and they start with a pilot. They sit with the operators who have got all of the information that I've showed you just coming in. And then what we work towards doing is to continually train. And this is an interesting space with VTS because it's kind of new. Sydney is only the 15th certified VTS in Australia, and so what's happened is it's a very collaborative approach that we have with the other VTSs around the country. So that brings me to the end. I'm not sure if anybody's got any questions. I hope I didn't rattle on too much. And if you have got questions, what I've just done is I've just brought this screen up that the PIANC team have asked me to share with you, and that's some of the upcoming events. I'd like to thank PIANC for allowing me to do this presentation. I know that it's a little bit different to what it ordinarily is in the sphere of engineering, but I've certainly really, enjoyed getting the message of VTS out there. And I have to thank Port Authority for that as well.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That was this is Bart from Trelleborg here. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to very quickly wrap up as we're running out of time. So thanks again for the great presentation. It's very interesting. We really appreciate it. Congratulations again on your new position as a harbour master for Tasmania. That's really great. Thank you also Shahab, Kath and Kenan for coordinating the webinar. If you have any questions, please, because we run out of time, please send them over via email to Kenan. Kenan, can you please just include your email on this group chat? I'm just going to very quickly wrap it up with some upcoming events. So on the 17th of August, there will be another webinar held. This time it will be on PIANC working groups, and it will be organized together with COPEP. Then on the 10th of September, we will have YP Sundowner event, most likely in Sydney CBD. We aim to have this one attended in person, if it is obviously still to be confirmed. In October, November, there will be a PIANC New South Wales panel and QA event titled Cruise 2020, also aiming for in-person attendance. And lastly, the PIANC APAC event in Fremantle. Please note that this conference will be held regardless of travel restrictions. If such are still in place, then a suitable virtual platform will be developed. Please feel free to get involved in the mentoring program. EOIs are finishing tomorrow. There's a very short registration of interest process, so just an email to support@pianc.org.au. There's more information in the link which I'm sending right now on the group chat. It's a great initiative, so please get involved. Also, just reminding that this presentation has been recorded, and you will be able to find it on our PIANC ANZ YouTube channel, and the link is also provided by me right now. So once again, thanks everyone for your time. Thanks again, Wendy, and have a great afternoon.